Good evening. My name is David Bubis, Director of Philanthropy at Public Counsel. Welcome to our second of 10 Hour of Justice panel discussions, where we will be exploring a variety of legal and social issues and challenges facing our community and country. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Before I introduce tonight's panel, I want to thank and acknowledge the co-sponsors of our series, the Beverly Hills Bar Association, the Daily Journal, the LA chapter of the Federal Bar Association, the LA County Bar Association, and the Mexican American Bar Association. We appreciate your support and for your assistance in getting the word out about our Hour of Justice discussions. I also want to acknowledge and thank Public Counsel's immediate past board chair, Philip Cook, for his vision and leadership in making this series possible. As you may be aware, Public Counsel is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. Public Counsel is the largest pro bono law firm in the nation. We work with major law firms and corporations to change people's futures. Our 130 staff made up of attorneys, social workers, and support staff, along with 5,000 volunteer lawyers, law students, and others, assist over 30,000 children, youth, families, and community organizations each year. Our activities are far-ranging and impact a wide spectrum of people who live at or below the poverty level. Tonight, we will again focus on one issue that we work on intently every day, the mass homelessness population in LA County and beyond. Tonight's panel discussion is entitled, "What is Los Angeles doing to address our homelessness crisis?" On our last Hour of Justice session, we discussed the looming eviction crisis facing our community, especially in light of the current economic COVID crisis. Tonight, we want to turn our attention more toward current and possible future responses to help our community finally turn the corner on solving our ongoing homelessness crisis. With the elections now behind us, what can we expect from our local, state, and national leaders to help us get to potential solutions? We have assembled a well-informed and respected panel tonight to explore this topic. It's my pleasure now to introduce them along with our moderator. Mike Bonin is a LA City Council member from the 11th District. Mike represents West Side neighborhoods, which include Pacific Palisades, Brentwood, West LA, Sawtelle, Mar Vista, Del Rey, Venice, Marina Del Rey, Playa Vista, Playa Del Rey, Westchester, and Ladera. As council member, Mike has been a champion of neighborhoods, a force for smart, responsive government, and a progressive voice for social justice. His work is focused on building mass transit and reducing traffic, ending homelessness, protecting the environment, strengthening public safety, and fixing the city's broken development process to better serve residents and put neighborhoods first. Mike and his husband, Sean Arian, live in Mar Vista with their young son. A Massachusetts native and former newspaper reporter, Mike graduated from Harvard University in 1989 with a BA in U.S. history. Lorraine Lopez is a supervising staff attorney for Homelessness Prevention Law Project at Public Counsel. She coordinates the project's eviction defense and housing preservation work and serves as Public Counsel's representative in the LA Right to Counsel Coalition. Previously, Lorraine was a supervising attorney for the coordinated attorney team at Neighborhood Legal Services of LA County. There, she led a team of over 10 attorneys practicing in a wide range of areas, including housing, consumer, public benefits, homelessness prevention, and reentry. From 2009 to 17, she worked at Inner City Law Center as a staff attorney and then as supervising attorney for their Shriver Housing Project. Lorraine began her career as a 2005 Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Legal Assistance Foundation of Metropolitan Chicago, where she provided legal services, education outreach for participants in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. In 2007, she moved to LA to work with Eviction Defense Network, where she learned the specific legal challenges of low-income renters in LA. Carol Sobel is a civil rights lawyer and advocate. She has repeatedly sued the city of LA for violating the rights of the homeless population. Ms. Sobel spent 20 years working for the ACLU Foundation of Southern California, most recently as senior staff counsel. In 1997, she left the ACLU to start her own law practice. Ms. Sobel has served as the lead attorney on several cases representing the homeless against the city of Los Angeles. In these cases, quality of life ordinances criminalizing conduct such as sleeping in a vehicle or leaving property unattended were found to be unconstitutional, protecting the rights of the homeless population. Ms. Sobel serves on the board of directors for several organizations that advocate for proactive approaches to similar issues, including the National Police Accountability Project and the Los Angeles Center for Community Law and Action. She regularly gives talks on her work and is currently an adjunct professor at Loyola Law School, where she teaches civil rights practicum. Ms. Sobel was recognized as a highly accomplished super lawyer for civil rights for 2004 through this year. And finally, Henry Weinstein, our moderator tonight. Henry is a professor of the practice of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. Previously, he was a journalist for over 40 years, working for the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, San Francisco Examiner, and Wall Street Journal. He has written more than 3,000 stories, reporting on the ground in 36 states plus the District of Columbia and Canada. He also has written about events and issues in other countries and for a variety of publications, including California Lawyer, Juris Doctor, The Nation, New Times, the Saturday Review of Education, and the Saturday Review of Science. A quick word about our format tonight. Henry will be moderating our discussion for about 40 to 45 minutes. At about 6:45 or so, we will give you all an opportunity to ask the panelists questions via the chat function on YouTube until we end at 7. Please do not wait until 6:45 to ask your questions. Go ahead and write them in as we go along. I will be monitoring them and passing along as many questions as possible to Henry. Thank you again for being here. We could not have asked for a more appropriate panel for our topic tonight. And without further ado, I pass the baton off to Henry.
Thank you very much, David. And first, let me say it's just an honor for me to be moderating a program being put on by Public Counsel. I first had contact with Public Counsel when I moved to Los Angeles in 1978 to join the Los Angeles Times. I think it's a great organization. And since I left the Times and fully acquired my political and First Amendment rights, I have been a frequent donor to the organization. So tonight we are once again discussing what is regrettably a topic that preceded Donald Trump and will go on regrettably after Donald Trump leaves the White House. 2 years ago, the Los Angeles Times, where I used to work, published a scathing series of editorials which turned into a small book called Our National Disgrace, Homelessness in the City of Angels. Los Angeles voters have given a lot of indication that they wanted to do something to this problem. They did one of those rare things. They voted themselves a tax increase, which I believe supposed to raise about $1.2 billion for housing and other services for the homeless. However, it seems like since that's happened, my impression is, and I'm sure the panelists will weigh in on this, that there has not been nearly as much progress as anyone would have anticipated. Late this spring, the Luskin Center at UCLA put out a report related to this situation. And I would just like to read one passage from the report to start the discussion. And here's what the comment was. It said, but the crisis at hand is not so much the containment of a virus as it is the inertia of political institutions to enact social protections for the vulnerable and disadvantaged. What is to come then in future months will be yet another round in the systematic unhousing of people, a process that has been underway in Los Angeles for a while now. With that as a starting point, Carol, why don't you lead off our discussion?
Okay, thank you. I've been working on these issues for about 20 years, and I have felt all along that Los Angeles has spent a disproportionate amount of time on criminalization and building shelters, and neither one gets us anywhere in terms of addressing this problem. So I'm going to go through a couple of numbers. I think this is an economic issue, and I'm going to tell you why housing makes sense, and it's the only thing that makes sense. I'm going to do this quickly, but my email's on the website if you want a copy. $1,400. This is the mean rent for the bottom level apartment in the city of Los Angeles. Keep that number in mind, okay? Number two, $129. That is what it costs to put somebody in jail with the LAPD for a night in Los Angeles. Multiply that out by 30, days and you get almost $4,000, far more than the $1,400 you need to put somebody in jail. Right now, we depend a lot on shelters, and we've increased shelters. $61 is what LAHSA pays for each person in a shelter per day. That comes to $1,830 a month, almost $400 more than the mean apartment rent. If you have a couple, it's almost $4,000 a month, way more than putting them in an apartment. And if you have a family, let's say a mother with 2 children or a couple with a child, it's $5,500 a month. You could put somebody in an apartment for far less. So are shelters successful? No. At moving people into anything better? If you put somebody in a bottom line drop-in shelter, the basic shelter, they have a 5% chance of moving into housing. If you put them in a low barrier shelter, they have a 15% chance. And if you put them in a bridge to home shelter, like the city is now investing a lot of money in, they had, before the pandemic, a 25% chance of moving to housing. I understand that number has now dropped to about 17%. Just so you understand, all of these numbers come from city reports, LAHSA reports, none of them are mine. So most people need help because in support for an apartment because they can't afford to live in LA with how the rents are. If you make $15 an hour, what Los Angeles calls a living wage, your total for the month before taxes, if you work 35 hours a week, and a lot of people don't part-time, is $2,100 a month. Try living on that. We passed a statewide rent control law last year. It went into effect. It limits rent increases to 5% plus the cost of living. In Los Angeles in the past, that has been 3%. So that means an 8% cost of living is allowed for landlords. 1.6%, that's what Social Security went up last year. And that's important because Los Angeles is a growing number of seniors who are on the streets. Many of them are women. The average Social Security for a woman in Los Angeles is a little over $1,400 a month if she is a white woman. It is less if she is a Black woman, and even lower than that for a brown woman or an Asian woman. 55% of women depend solely on Social Security when they get to that age. We have several problems in Los Angeles. Before the pandemic, we had a housing shortage. Now we have the pandemic, which is leading to a greater eviction threat because people don't have their jobs. We had 2 recessions. In the 2008 recession, the baby boomers became eligible for Social Security. People lost their jobs because they were older workers, and they filed for Social Security at 62, the first group of baby boomers. That meant that they would forever get 30% less than if they had been able to wait until they were someplace between 66 and 70. When your average is $1,400 a month, 30% more is critical. And now we face another crisis, and the baby boomers, again, are expected to be one of the largest groups of homeless people. And that's according to Dennis Culhane, who is one of the experts the city hired to help them come up with a plan for homelessness. So again, not my numbers. So what is the solution? Housing, housing, housing. I feel a little bit like NBC in the elections. But that is really, what we need. And if we don't develop housing, nothing else will matter. The projections for how many people are going to be on the street is enormous. But what I hope is the takeaway from what I've just presented is if the cost of an apartment is $1,400 a month, and we are spending far more than that to keep somebody in a shelter, we are doing it wrong. Finally, as I said, most people, or a very significant number of people who are unhoused for economic reasons. And they don't require the services in the shelter. They don't require services generally. They just require a place where they can live and pay the rent.
Thank you, Carol. Next, I'd like to call on Councilman Mike Bonin. And Councilman, one thing I want to just ask you at the start is to, among other things, is to address, there's a real question here, it seems to me, of who's in charge. There's not really a homelessness czar here to do things. And there seems to be some competition between the city and the county. And in fact, in a recent hearing, Judge Carter, who's presiding over a major litigation involving homelessness in Los Angeles, said as follows: the city and county remind me of two millionaires and McDonald's fighting over who will pay for a hamburger while a starving homeless person is hanging out in the parking lot. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks for that. I will get to your question about where the authority and accountability lies. I do want to start a little bit broader, though, if you don't mind, Henry. Thank you for having me follow Carol. You introduced her as having a history of litigation against the city. What you didn't say is, I don't know that when it comes to homelessness that Carol has ever lost a case against the city. She certainly has not in my experience. And I think that's telling because it indicates that the city of Los Angeles consistently for decades has been approaching homelessness the wrong way. There's a natural tendency when you add an elected official to this panel for that elected official to try to put the optimistic spin on things, to talk about all the successes and to talk about the way things really aren't as bad as they look. Things are as bad as they look. I'm not going to try to put a spin on it. I think the status quo sucks. And I think we are on this hamster wheel where we keep creating the status quo. I find it horrendously objectionable that we keep doing that because we've created a system by which homelessness is inevitable in Los Angeles. I mean, I'll step back a bit and channel my inner Bernie Sanders. Homelessness is the inevitable byproduct of one of the inevitable byproducts of the American economic and social system. But in Los Angeles, it is particularly acute because some of the dynamics that we engage in. We have consistently, despite having our ass kicked by Carol repeatedly for 20 years, placed enforcement ahead of housing as a strategy for homelessness. And we do a little bit on homelessness and then we revert back to enforcement as if, okay, we've been good on our diet for a day and a half, so we can cheat. And that results in a continued proliferation of the problem. We don't address, and a lot of this isn't just the city's responsibility, it's county and state and federal. We don't address the structural causes of homelessness. And so we keep allowing homelessness to happen, and then we're chasing after it and trying very inefficiently to house people. A third problem is that Los Angeles chronically has an addiction to doing only one thing at a time when it comes to homelessness, and it inevitably seems to choose the slowest and most expensive and least effective solutions. So for a very long time, our solution of choice was permanent supportive housing, which is an absolutely successful and necessary intervention for a certain segment of homelessness. And then we doubled down on bridge housing, and I supported PSH and I support bridge housing, but we doubled down on that almost exclusively, and that was our focus. And we consistently fail to do things that are simple, that are quick, and that are efficient. And one of those is housing, Carol is right, is the solution. Not every unit of housing requires an individual to have their own place, nor does it require a capital investment and years of constructing brick and mortar. We can master lease apartments and have units available right away. We can put people in roommate situations where that communal experience is actually strengthening and helpful to them. But because we focus our attention on permanent supportive housing, that's usually for people who are chronically homeless or who have disabilities or other problems as well and need the wraparound services. Not the case for most people. As a result, we are telling people when they become newly homeless, when they're easiest to help, when it is least expensive to help them, you are not homeless enough for help. So we inevitably make homelessness worse, and we inevitably make chronic homelessness worse, and we inevitably drive up our own costs. There's a lot of different reasons for that. I hope we get into it, but as promised, I'll get back to your question. Part of the problem is a structural one, in that there is no accountability in Los Angeles's governance system. That's intentional. It's a result of progressive era reforms a century ago, where authority is diffused. We have a separate school district and a separate city and a separate county. We have a separate transit agency. God help us, we have our own vector control district, which is all separate. And there is no one person who is in charge of homelessness. And there's no one person who could force me or one of my colleagues or a county supervisor to be responsive. So it's a system that is inherently broken. I'm not entirely pessimistic. It can change. I mean, we can address a lot of the structural things, and I think there's a renewed focus on that. We can do a vacancy tax, we can do social housing, we can do things that make it quicker to get people off the street. But it's going to take a big shakeup in our mentality to do that. And every time we do something wrong, and every time Carol takes us to court and we lose again, it's yet another reminder that the solution is housing. Housing and services, housing and services, housing and services. Those two things are what we need to keep doing. And every time we distract ourselves with a 6-hour council deliberation that leads to a lawsuit and attempts at enforcement, we lose sight of that and we step backwards and fall backwards.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to call on Lorraine. Your organization on a daily, hourly basis works on behalf of homeless people, both in a variety of fronts. One of the things that I wanted you to address is besides all the local cases, there is a federal precedent now from a case called Martin versus City of Boise, which followed up on a case that Carol did years ago called Jones. And it says that basically you can't criminalize somebody for sleeping in public when there is no other housing for them. But somehow it seems at the moment, it looks like the city is sort of trying to get around that with some proposals that were recently brought in front of the city council. Could you talk about that issue and the other things that public council is doing at the moment to work on this problem?
Yes, thank you. So one of the issues that we deal with in the work that I've been doing, we provide a lot of direct services. So we are working directly with a lot of the folks on the ground who are either experiencing homelessness or on the brink of homelessness. And one of the frustrations that we've had is that instead of creating more long-term solutions, a lot of what we see coming out of the city as far as handling the homelessness problem is to criminalize it and instead shift the problem to different sectors, and largely been using the criminal justice system as part of the solution to curing homelessness, which is really just removing homelessness from visibility from the streets and shuffling it off somewhere else. And one of the issues that we've had is that if you don't actually have housing to place these individuals in, or these families, then that only exacerbates the problem. So not only have you place someone into the criminal justice system, now because they've been through the criminal justice system, they're going to have even more difficulty becoming housed. They're going to have more difficulty becoming employed. And it just creates additional barriers to becoming housed. So it becomes this really terrible cycle of cycling in and out of homelessness and the criminal justice system and never really being able to break out of it. And this is a lot of the circumstances that do lead to chronic homelessness, because if you can't be employed, if you can't find somewhere to live, that can actually create mental health issues. It creates addiction issues. It becomes a really terrible cycle that it becomes really hard to break out of. And we work with a lot of these individuals who really just have a cycle of one bad thing after another happening to them. And even though, with measures like Measure H, which for the first time brought attorneys to homeless services, so actually recognized attorneys as a valuable tool to work with folks on the ground, we can only do so much if the housing doesn't exist, if the services don't exist, if we can't get employment for these clients. There's we can go ahead and remove a ticket from the record. We can try to reinstate a license, but sometimes it doesn't really matter because once you've already been in that system, it's really hard to break out of it. So that's been one of the issues that we've dealt with. And most recently, as you mentioned, there was an ordinance that was proposed, and luckily it's been rolled back. And we want to congratulate Mike Bonin for also being a voice against that, hopefully. And it would have basically prohibited homeless encampments from being placed within 50 yards of any homeless shelter or homeless services facility. So really, the few areas where homeless individuals feel comfortable and safe enough to actually stay near there, where they can get services, where they know that they have outreach workers. Now we're telling them you can't even be there. And this would also have included freeway underpasses. And as you know, Los Angeles is a city of freeways. This really would have limited a lot of the areas where folks could find shelter, and especially now in the winter months, where hopefully we're going to get a lot more rain. But that presents certain issues for folks who are living outside and who are unhoused. So it was really removing a valuable kind of not naturally occurring shelter, but a shelter that is available to a lot of folks and where a lot of homelessness encampments are set up.
Thank you. Thank you. Carol, I want to come back to you with an opening question. Besides all of the problems that you described from what you portrayed as ill-designed strategies, there does seem to be another thing that's a very significant problem here, which is that the pace of the cost of housing has gone up dramatically more in recent years in Los Angeles than incomes have gone up. And that seems to be something that's really contributing to this. I believe when I read the Luskin study, it said that there were some families that were spending about 90% of their income on rent. That is clearly not sustainable. And you were also saying that if $15 is not really a living wage in Los Angeles. Is there anything realistically that can be done about that?
Well, I think, and I will note that my friend David Lash emailed me during this program to tell me that rents went up 30%, while income in the same period went up 5%. So thank you, David. And I think that, we have to look at housing subsidy programs. We have to look at repurposing buildings that are empty now. We have to figure out ways of bringing in some modular units that are much cheaper. I think the focus has been, part of it is that the money that has been available largely up till now was for permanent supportive housing. And that is much more expensive because it has a lot of regulations attached to it. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think one of the things that would be really important would be to have a comprehensive review of all of the regulations that are attached to these funding sources and figure out what do we need in today's world. For example, it used to be that you used to have like a kitchenette or something like that. There are tons of appliances now that allow people to cook an entire stove. And so are there things we can do that lessen the cost of some of this? And while the stove may seem to be like a minor thing, that's running a line. That's running a line for gas. All of those things are really expensive. How do we deal, could we do something else that reduces the cost? I understand that land is the costliest item here, but we have some land that is available that we could put modular units on, and the modular units are much less expensive. And I want to say this: the freeway clearance is my fault. Judge Carter, I'm an intervener in that case, and the city had intended to put housing under the freeways, and we opposed that. We said this is unsafe. This is hazardous to people's health. People have asthma, they have COPD, they have other issues, and we should not house people under the freeway. To which Judge Carter basically took off and said, okay, then we're not going to have them under the freeway at all. And it's become sort of this misdirection from my point of view. And I've expressed that openly in court, so I'm not saying anything Judge Carter hasn't heard. People are safer under the freeway. If the only alternative is forcing them out of there on pain of criminalization, they are safer under there because they are protected from the elements, at least. So as we approach winter, it's better to have those communities there than it is to have them scattered all over the place on threat of arrest. And then the other problem with the freeway focus at this point is that we tend to respond to the homelessness crisis in this city by listening to the loudest voice. Whichever neighborhood yells the most about homeless people living in their community, that's who we respond to, instead of responding based on the needs of people. So the most vulnerable people are not being housed while people under the freeway are. And that's really the wrong way to go, and is probably one reason why the number of homeless people who have died on the street in Los Angeles this year is up so dramatically. You can't have people with comorbidities, older people, baking in the sun on the sidewalk and not have them die. And so I think that's part of the whole problem with the homelessness issue is it not only is not one person in charge, no one is thinking about this in a rational way about what is the problem, who are the most vulnerable people, and how are we going to address the most vulnerable people first.
Okay, Mike, all three of you thus far have, in one way or another, said that the city is using techniques, methods, whatever, repeatedly that don't seem to be working.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess what I'd like to ask you at the moment is, what is it that is the biggest impediment to getting people to change direction, to do some things in different ways that will be more effective?
Well, there's a few different things. The first I would say is that I think almost every element of the discussion about homelessness in Los Angeles is framed within a fiction or a misunderstanding at all levels. At the community level, the biggest thing that I hear when I oppose a criminalization effort is you have chosen the interests of unhoused people over the interests of housed people. Mm-hmm. That you hear all the time. And for me, there is no choice between the two. Mm-hmm. If the only way to address the concerns of people who don't like unhoused in their neighborhoods is to house the people who are unhoused. It is a false choice. The solution to address the concerns of both are the same. One of the second myths and misunderstanding is that the solution always requires additional brick and mortar. And as I indicated earlier, it doesn't always require additional brick and mortar. You know, the county has a successful program that very few people know about, Housing for Health, where the health department invested healthcare dollars into leasing or renting apartments so that when people who were chronic users of the emergency room came in who were homeless, instead of constantly treating them, they actually housed them, and it saved money and it housed people. We can, as I said, we can master lease units, we can do roommate situations. There's a whole range of things we can do in addition to providing new units that can get people off the streets sooner. A third is we have this mentality, and it's not exclusive to Los Angeles, where every housing solution has to involve the private sector. And we have a very complex and convoluted system that relies on density bonuses and tax incentives and tax credits and stuff like that. And it doesn't work. It's not enough to meet the scale of the problem. And it's the result of a system that has increasingly over the past couple generations treated housing not as something to live in, but as something to invest in. And we need to be, the government needs to be purchasing land, whether it's hotels under Project Home Key now, whether it's through purchasing things that are being put up for foreclosure under a new state legislation, whether it's using eminent domain, whether it's using city-owned property. We need housing that is permanently off the speculative market so we can keep it permanently affordable, and we need to go big on that. And the other myth is that we need to be trying to solve this in quick and simple ways. So much of our policy is born of frustration. And that leads us to the policies of criminalization. And I say that not as somebody who's holier than thou. I say that as somebody who tried it. When I get into office, I tried that kind of stuff. I supported that kind of stuff. And it didn't work. It made the problem worse. We have this ordinance that Lorraine was talking about that is going through the council right now. We deferred it. It's coming back, which is saying here are places where you can tell people that they cannot sit, sleep, or lie. And the idea behind it is if you offer somebody a bed, you should be able to tell them they cannot be on the street. Well, that whole conversation is premised on the idea that we actually have the alternatives for people to go. We don't. I think it's misleading for us and disingenuous for us to even have that public conversation and give people the impression, housed and unhoused, that we have those places for people to go, because we don't have them yet. So let's not even have the discussion. We need to be focusing our time, our energy, our resources, our effort on actually providing the housing, and anything else is a distraction.
Lorraine, I know that we said at the start that we weren't going to spend the entire evening on evictions, but nonetheless, I want to return to that topic because we've had these eviction moratoriums that are, basically running out, which has the prospect of a great number of people being evicted, also being evicted at a time when we're facing colder weather, when there are all these, forecasts, quite reasonable forecasts that we're going to have many more sick people as a result of the pandemic, and clearly having a lot of people who don't have shelter is not going to be a good thing for that. Is there anything that's in the offing that could forestall any of this at the state level or at the local level that can be done?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because a lot of times when we talk about homelessness, eviction seems to be divorced from that conversation. And only until more recently have we really seen eviction as a feeder into the homelessness population. So now when we talk about eviction defense, we actually talk about homelessness prevention. So
Right.
One of the important things that we've had right now, AB 3088, which was passed by the state and which provided a lot of the more recent protections for tenants, is actually one of the few things that is staving off homelessness for a lot of families, and especially here in LA County.
Mhm.
And we're fortunate enough that the city passed protections for tenants, as did LA County, which actually helped a lot at the beginning of the crisis. And then AB 3088 helped to reinforce those protections. So what folks don't realize is right now we have an unprecedented rate of people who are unemployed in Los Angeles. And where are these folks going to go when these moratoriums are lifted? So what's really important right now is, yes, we have some what we call moratoriums, and we call them tenant protections and eviction defense circles. Our protections are eventually going to expire at the end of this year. And so what is going to happen? We're still not going to have a lot of certainty on jobs at this moment. There are a lot of industries that may not rebound immediately. Everything is so up in the air right now. So how are folks actually going to pay back all of this rent? So one of the things that we have been pushing for as advocates is for rents to be canceled. And we know that this is a conversation that Councilmember Bonin is very much in support of. And, we hope that other elected officials get behind this, because at the end of the day, while folks may want to pay their rent, nobody likes being in financial debt. It's just going to be impossible. There's no way for folks to get back on their feet, start working again, and then not only pay rent right now, then pay back rent as well. That is just a fallacy that's going to happen. And the other important thing is I'm going to say this because I've been doing eviction defense for a very long time now. But those of us in our community, we've been shouting about this for a long time. A lot of the work that we do, and especially here in LA and around LA County, is trying to preserve what we term naturally occurring affordable housing. So this is all of the rental stock that is at below market rate, and we're trying to keep these folks housed, and we're trying to make sure that they don't lose these rent control tendencies, because they are so important to a lot of the families who live here in Los Angeles and who have been living here for a long time and have created a community here. And one of the things that I was very encouraged to hear from both Mike and Carol is that this is an economic problem. This is a problem of economy. All of the folks that we rely on for our most basic services here in Los Angeles, all of our essential workers, they're the ones living in this rental housing. They're the ones that need to be in LA. And they're very quickly, I'm not even going to say slowly, very quickly being priced out of Los Angeles. So you're losing not only, affordable housing, but you're losing your workforce. And that is essential to the infrastructure of Los Angeles. And if there's no way that anybody can understand why this issue is so important, that is one of the ways to think about it. If you lose your workforce, the city falls apart.
Can I add something to that, Henry?
Yes, Mike, go ahead.
If I might, I just want to say I agree with everything Lorraine said, and I think I'd put a point on it to say that if we are not serious about aggressive envelope pushing ways to address and prevent evictions, we're really not serious about addressing homelessness. We really are not. The idea of canceling rent may sound to a lot of people like a very radical suggestion. Well, it wasn't too many decades ago that Social Security was a radical suggestion. It wasn't too long ago that Medicare was a radical suggestion. And we are not at this moment where the circumstances in our society are a blip. This is a huge moment, and it demands of us a New Deal level response. And homelessness is only going to get significantly worse if we don't address this. There are a ton of pathways into homelessness, and they are wide and they are fast and they are slippery. And there are very few pathways out, and they're narrow and they're sclerotic and they're slow and they're hard. And one of the biggest pathways in is eviction. And I said earlier at the beginning, homelessness in Los Angeles is inevitable. It doesn't have to be. And addressing the eviction crisis is one way we can make sure it doesn't have to be.
Just to, if I could just add something, Henry.
Yes.
Assuming we have a vaccine by late next spring and enough people get vaccinated, let's just make that assumption. We're talking about 15 months at least of a shutdown in Los Angeles. And even if you take the bottom rent of $1,400 a month, that's $21,000 that somebody would owe in rent. That is the income level for the poverty level in Los Angeles. These are all tied together. If you owe if you make $21,000, you're at the poverty level. How are you going to pay back $21,000?
Very good question, Carol. Before we turn to questions from the audience, I'd like to ask you another question. It relates to the role of the judiciary. Many years ago, a courageous federal judge, Frank Johnson, took over a very corrupt and horribly run prison system in the state of Alabama. In this instance, we have a judge who first did a lot of work on this issue in Orange County, David Carter, and now he's up here. And I just want to, and one of the things that strikes me is that it seems as if some of the officials are perhaps doing less than they could because they've let this problem fall or go into the lap of a federal judge rather than stepping up to the plate themselves. You don't have to agree with me, but I just want to know what you think about that and what role you think there is for a judge, because a judge can't build. He can do other things, but he can't build housing.
So I don't think they had to lay back much from Judge Carter to be doing any less than they were already doing. to be quite honest.
Okay.
As I said, I've been doing this for 20 years. You know, when we got the Jones decision, that settlement in 2007, all the city had to do to get out of Jones at the time, which is the lawsuit that lets people sleep on the sidewalk in their tents. All the city had to do was create 1,200 units of permanent and supportive housing, half in Skid Row, half outside Skid Row. 12 years later, they had not met that number. That's pretty sad. That's really pretty sad. And in the interim, the affordable the low income market had dropped. We tied Jones to a lawsuit that Legal Aid brought, the Wiggins case, to preserve low income housing in Los Angeles, particularly on Skid Row. I can't tell you how many times they have had to go back into court when the city tried to destroy some of the housing that was included, that was protected in that. We have fewer shelter beds. When we started a few years ago, we had fewer shelter beds on Skid Row than we had in 1986 when then Mayor Bradley put in a moratorium on the destruction of low-income housing on Skid Row. So it would be really hard. What I do think the federal judges could do, and they're somewhat constrained. I think that they can suspend enforcement. That is the biggest weapon that they have. Suspend enforcement until certain criteria are met. The difficulty with this case, and I am one of the lawyers in the Orange County litigation that sort of gave birth to the Los Angeles case, is that Judge Carter has applied a formula that says if you create shelter for 60% of your unhoused population, you can then begin enforcement. We were skeptical about that number at the outset. It was supposed to be a test. It has somehow become enshrined in stone. It doesn't really work in Orange County. It absolutely doesn't work in Los Angeles. And the reason it doesn't work in Los Angeles is when you're talking about 40% of, let's say, with the people on the street since the pandemic, 100,000 people, you're talking about 40,000 people that you're going to put in jail. You know, it's crazy. Or you're going to walk up to one and leave the other 39,000. So it doesn't work. So I think that while I think Judge Carter's focus is in the right place in trying to deal with this, I think the recalcitrance in the city and the county, and I'll be really honest, because we've said this again in open court, the city is playing Judge Carter in this case. The city is using money they just got from the county to fund housing they had already committed to and already ordered before this lawsuit was even filed. And that to me is just further evidence of why the city isn't really serious about reaching any real solutions.
So on that, I would, I have slightly different perspective on the Judge Carter situation from Carol. She's obviously got considerably more history with it. But what I know is that since Judge Carter has engaged, I'm seeing more energy and focus and action from the entire council. Whereas, a year ago, there were a handful of people who were actually trying to take big and substantive steps. I don't agree with everything the judge is doing. I'm not particularly enamored of the focus on the freeways, as I've shared with him, because it actually, I think, draws resources away from my district where there aren't a tremendous amount of freeways and makes it harder for me to craft solutions in some ways. But I'm over the lack of accountability and the lack of progress. I am just over it. And I think we need to stop dancing around. And I would prefer, and I've put this in writing and I made it as a counter proposal to the criminalization ordinance that was before the council 2 weeks ago. Let's just enter into a master settlement agreement or a consent decree. I don't care what the hell the format is. I want somebody who can actually make the city do things. And I agree with Carol. I don't think the 60% formula works. So let's not put that into the agreement. Let's make sure that's not part of it. But as long as we are dealing with 80 something cities all scattered about, 15 different council members, 5 supervisors, it ain't going to happen in any serious way. And so I'm encouraging my colleagues, let's get out of our way, let's get our egos out of the way, and let's just actually commit to a process that forces us to do this with measures and accountability and actual real progress.
Thank you, Mike. We have a number of good questions from the audience. The first one is for Carol from audience member Val Carlson, and it says, what would we be able to achieve with the kind of public housing that the City Council's social housing motion asked the city to look into?
Well, I actually think if I could, I think Mike actually addresses that issue more than I do.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Val.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for the question, Val. And I'm encouraged by the thought that you may have actually heard about the social housing proposal before tonight. That would actually be a good thing. Social housing is, it's a nicer way of saying public housing, because public housing has been done so poorly in the United States by design through real estate interests and people who are interested in discriminatory systems. In Europe, particularly in Vienna, there is a model where 60% of the housing units in Vienna are ones that are owned by the government, are off the private speculative market. And the housing is not just for people who are low income, it's for people who are middle income, it's mixed income. Government officials and working moms and celebrities and bus operators all live together in these great communities. It's housing done right. And what I'm pushing to see us do is do it on a lot of different levels. We have an opportunity now through the purchase of failing hotels to get a lot of inventory to start. That's a way to get our sort of feet wet in it. If we were to do social housing right, if we were actually to invest in publicly owned housing that can be managed by nonprofits or by community land trust or by tenant cooperatives, we would have the ability to make a huge and significant impact. It's a different paradigm than what we're used to, but we're not going to shift from where we are to a place where people are indoors unless we have a different paradigm.
Thanks, Mike. Next question comes from audience member Brian Dyer, and whoever wants to take this one, it's fine. He notes that there's a rallying cry about it, that housing is expensive because of supply and demand, and asks, how do we actually make sure that data on supply is transparent when banks, apartments, and real estate industries fight to obscure it?
I guess I'll take that one a little bit.
Okay.
There's a couple different steps we can take. One, I've proposed that we actually do a different level of disclosure about LLCs and what they own and who actually owns them in the city of Los Angeles, where everything is sort of hidden by a shell company behind a shell company behind a shell company. And that's one step we can take, at least have the basic knowledge of who owns what. The second is, there's a fight. There's an argument over, do we have a glut of vacant luxury housing in Los Angeles? Well, my thing is, let's call the bluff. Let's do what Vancouver has done. Let's do what Oakland has done. And let's oppose an empty homes penalty, vacancy tax, call it whatever you want, that penalizes people for having vacant units. It will either create a revenue source for housing programs, which is not my preference, or it will disincentivize having vacant units and putting more units back out onto the housing market. Those are two steps. Social housing is another one. Having inclusionary zoning in Los Angeles is another one. There's a number of steps that can be taken. A lot of them, however, require voter approval to do them.
Thank you. Lorraine, I'm going to have you start on the next one, which is the statistics. This relates to a question one of the audience members. Statistics show that roughly a third of the people who are homeless in Los Angeles have significant mental health issues, including dementia. What is the city doing, or what more could be done to assist people in that situation who are in particularly trouble?
So this kind of goes back to a conversation that Mike was having earlier about permanent supportive housing. Those are the types of folks that that type of housing was created for those who have disabilities, who have chronic conditions that do need those wraparound services. So traditionally, that's where a lot of those individuals would actually get treatment. The problem has been that in California, we have significantly reduced investment in mental health services, and especially public mental health services. A lot of that treatment is now privatized. So for folks who don't have insurance, who are on Medi-Cal, they're not going to get the same level of mental health services as someone on the private market. So one of the things that does need to be done is significant investment in our Department of Mental Health to provide more public mental health services, and things as easy as regular therapy appointments, regular medication management appointments. A lot of folks do not have access to these services. So even though they do have significant mental health problems or even cognitive impairments like dementia, they just don't get the medical treatment that they need because of the shortfall in our own health system.
Can I address this a moment?
Go ahead.
Henry,
Yes.
so I think that number 30% doesn't really reflect what people are reporting. This comes from a lot of the point in time count. And the question put to people is whether they have experienced it. Some have in the past, some have currently, and it is a degree. It is a sliding scale of what people have experienced. I don't think that everyone needs the same level of services. We work a lot, for example, with women. We've dealt a lot with women who are on the street, who are the victims of sexual assault, domestic violence. They need a stable place to live and to get their lives back on track. And almost everyone on who is unhoused has some degree of PTSD. And the thing that I have found most unsettling over the last year, although they've now moved to do this, is we passed Prop 63 a number of years ago, which was called the millionaire's tax. This was to produce money for mental health services.
Right.
By last year, the County of Los Angeles had $1.3 billion in unspent money. That means that they left people on the streets without assistance while this money remained unspent. And if you need help and you don't get help and you're living on the streets, your condition is only going to get worse. And if we stabilize people and give them a stable place to live for a significant portion of the number who self-reported some mental illness, they will be able to return to what their lives were before they became homeless.
And I'd like to add just one thing to that, because two things. One, let me thank the voters of Los Angeles County who just approved Measure J, because that will take some money from incarceration and put it into housing and health and mental health and jobs. But one other thing I think is important to note when we talk about mental health, and frankly, when we talk about addiction among people who are unhoused, is the conversation tends to get framed as people are homeless because of mental illness, or people are homeless because of addiction. That's certainly true in many cases. Mm-hmm. I'm somebody who is a recovering addict and drug addict. I'm also somebody who suffers from chronic depression. So I know a little bit about what I'm talking about when I talk about addiction and when I talk about mental health. Yes, mental health issues and substance abuse issues sometimes lead to homelessness. But guess what? Homelessness is as much a cause of mental health issues and addiction and substance abuse issues as it is the consequence of it. If you are living on the street and you are daily encountering some form of trauma, if you are like me and you suffer from depression, if I were living on the streets, and I spent a few nights in my youth on the streets, if I were living on the streets again, that would manifest itself as a far more significant mental health issue that I would not have the opportunity living on the streets to have treated. If I were back out on the streets, if I had not ever tried drugs, I would have been likely exposed to them. And there are many people who become addicted or develop substance abuse as a consequence of being homeless. And one of the best ways we can deal with people who are suffering from an addiction or a mental health issue who are living on the streets is to house them, because you are not going to get well living on the streets, and you are not going to get clean and sober very easily living on the streets. And a lot of people say, make them get well first, make them get clean first. Well, even if that were possible, and it's very, very difficult, they're still homeless when they're taking their meds. They're still homeless when they're sober. We got to get a roof over their heads and get people sober and get people housed.
One member of the audience has raises a point that we should not conclude this discussion without addressing in some way, and it's racial disparities. The latest report I saw said that 75% of the people who are homeless in Los Angeles are people of color. I will also note that there are a number of people who are homeless who are veterans of the United States military who served their country, suffering from a PTSD. So if any of you would like to address anything in particular about the issue of racial disparities and any interaction, say, between people working on homelessness and the Veterans Administration or some other agency, the floor is yours.
I think the major issue is the racial disparity. We have had policies in the city council that approve developments that have led to gentrification. Whether it's putting in the metro, which is not just simply the city, or redevelopment of certain areas, largely where that land was affordable and where the land was available were communities of color. And I'm struck by what happened when at the George Floyd protests, when Mayor Garcetti then announced that we would move to reassign $150 million from the police and put it into our communities, our color. Actually, what he said was put it into our Black communities. And the response of the community was, where are those Black communities left? You've destroyed them all. And I think that is really true. I mean, Mike's district includes Oakwood, an historically Black community in the city of Los Angeles, populated by people who migrated here in the 30s from Arkansas. I've sued the city over Oakwood too, but that community is destroyed. South LA is becoming gentrified fast because it is accessible to USC and other areas. USC has built out and destroyed a lot of what was housing that communities of color lived in South LA. So I think that it is easily understandable that 40% of the homeless population, something like 40% is Black, if I recall correctly, and another 30% or so is Asian and Latino, and Latino is increasing. I've always thought that was not surprising with the day laborer community, but it means that the people who are historically at the bottom of the economic ladder in this country are at the bottom of the economic ladder in Los Angeles, and they live on the streets.
Well, and to the extent that, as I pointed out earlier, homelessness is systemically inevitable. It doesn't have to be, but it is. There are systemic racial barriers to getting unhomeless once you are homeless. In a system that has so much structural racism that it is harder to find housing if you are Black. It is harder to find a job if you are Black. It is harder to get credit if you're Black. All of that poses a series of barriers to getting unhoused, and it's been detailed pretty well in a report on Black homelessness in Los Angeles that the city and the county did a couple of years ago. But it's just another set of systemic causes of homelessness and barriers to getting out of homelessness.
Before I turn it back to David, Lorraine, could you add anything on this point?
Just there have also been a lot of reports and studies on how eviction is also very heavily laced with racial disparity as well, and that the families who tend to be evicted the most are Black women. So it is very important to keep in mind, as Mike mentioned, this is a very systemic issue, and it bleeds into every system that we deal with that involves housing in any way.
I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their very thoughtful comments. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. There were many good questions from a very thoughtful audience. And I know that the people in this audience are very concerned. So I will simply say, let your public officials know about your concerns and continue to support public counsel. David, floor is
Oh,
back
Henry,
to you.
you ended that perfectly. And I must say, this discussion could have gone on for at least another hour or two easily. And I want to really thank all of you, Mike and Lorraine and Carol and Henry, for your informed comments and your insights and your passion. And we look forward to further conversations like this. And this is not the end, but certainly we need more of these kinds of conversations to advance this and other issues. So thank you again for participating tonight. You were all terrific. Our next panel of our Hour of Justice will take place next Thursday, November 19th, where we'll explore the changing immigration law in the United States. Our panelists will be Martha Aravelo, Executive Director of the Central American Immigrants' Rights Project, Judy London, Directing Attorney for Public Counsel's Immigrants' Rights Project, Angelica Salas, Executive Director of the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, and the discussion will be moderated by Nora Adriana Preciado, Director of Immigrant Affairs in the Office of LA Mayor Eric Garcetti. For more information on the series and to register for future sessions, please go to hourofjustice.org for more information about how you can support public counsel's work and follow up on Henry's suggestion through donations of time or treasure. Please visit our website at publiccounsel.org. Thank you to our panelists again. Thank you all for attending tonight. Have a good evening.